A rotten chill clung to the narrow alleys of Paris on that fateful January morning in 1757, as if the city itself sensed the horror about to unfold. Damp cobblestones glistened in the dim light, slick with recent snow and the lingering echo of whispered rumors. In the heart of the city, beneath the looming silhouette of Notre Dame Cathedral, a crowd gathered at the Place de Grève, drawn by fear and fascination. All around, torches flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows against stone facades. The air felt heavy with expectancy and dread, as if time had slowed to spectacle the approaching terror. At the center of this grim stage stood Robert-François Damiens, a former royal servant whose trembling form betrayed a mind consumed by desperation. Bareheaded and bound at wrists and ankles, he shivered in a threadbare shirt that did little to ward off the biting cold. Only hours earlier, he had crept through royal corridors intent on a deed so audacious that it would shake the foundations of the French monarchy. A single stab aimed at the heart of King Louis XV had failed to kill the sovereign, but succeeded in brandishing Damiens forever as a living testament to desperation and folly. The morning's stillness fractured when guardsmen marched him from his cell, their boots striking the frozen ground in echoing rhythm. They prodded him forward, forcing his battered body onto the scaffold erected at the center of the square. Beyond the makeshift wooden structure, a mechanical framework weighted its polished iron shackles and leather straps, glinting coldly in torchlight. Crowds pressed forward, jostling for a closer view, their breaths forming faint clouds in the frigid air. Faces glowed red with anticipation. Some sneered at the criminal, others whispered prayers or curses under trembling breaths. Children clutched parents' skirts, ears pressed against winter-clad chests to catch every ominous word. Already rumors had spread that Damiens would not be merely hanged or beheaded. His crime demanded a punishment as brutal as betrayal of the crown itself. He had drawn royal blood. In the eyes of the Parlement of Paris, that act merited the most savage retribution. The memory of medieval justice lingered in hushed tones, the quartering, the breaking on the wheel. In the centuries past, traitors had endured the roar of horses tearing flesh limb from limb. Though France had grown more civilized, the thirst for deterrence remained unabated. As dawn's gray light filtered through morning mist, an air of grim ceremony descended. Executioners faceless behind black hoods approached carrying gleaming ropes and iron shackles. Their movements were deliberate practiced tragedy. Here was an art of precision. A hush fell. Even the wind seemed to pause. Damiens's eyes darted through the gathering, wild with fear-regret, and something like dark resolve. His lips quivered as if forming a final curse or plea, but no sound emerged. Around him, silent prayers passed rapidly through the crowd, mercy, vengeance, or simple acknowledgement that they would witness a spectacle France had not seen in generations. From that scaffold's highest plank, the executioners forced him to kneel. His bound hands reached out wrist to wrist, while an iron collar bit into his neck. A priest recited last rites, his voice low and somber, but few listened. Horror had priority over faith. A hush stretched taut, broken only by the crisp crackle of wood and the distant tolling of Notre Dame's bells. Then, with a signal too faint to discern the executioners, produced 4 massive horses, each steed, saddled and bridled, yet restless in the frozen arena. The horses pawed the ground, flaring nostrils echoing the crowd's collective heartbeat. They were chosen for strength and trained for this grim task to harness the sheer force that would rend a man asunder. In that moment, as night's shadows retreated, the consciousness of Damiens flickered between terror and something akin to defiance. The wind stung tears from his eyes, coating his cheeks with icy droplets. He was the last soul in France to face the ancient penalty of dismemberment by horse, a fate reserved for regicides and the most unforgivable of traitors. Behind him, hushed murmurs spoke of long-forgotten monarchs and disgraced nobles who had met similar ends. The weight of history pressed on the square like an unseen drapery, suffocating any hope of reprieve. And so, at the brink of mid-morning, with sky pale, and still the final act began. 4 executioners took their positions at ropes anchored to each limb of Damiens. Tension hummed in the air thicker than frost. A single word, spoken by a gray-clad magistrate stationed on a raised dais, sent the executioners to their reins. In that slivered second, a collective gasp rose from the crowd, pregnant with horror and morbid fascination. Then the 4 horses lunged outward. Robert-François Damiens' descent into desperation was neither sudden nor inexplicable. Born into an unremarkable bourgeois family in Valenciennes, he had grown up amid the rigid hierarchies of mid-18th century France. His father, a journeyman carpentry apprentice turned minor tax official, had instilled in young Robert a grudging respect for authority, yet also an ingrained frustration at the ceiling of social mobility. As Damiens matured, he secured a modest post in the royal household, an underpaid sinecure that offered neither prestige nor security. He rubbed shoulders with clergy and courtiers, glimpsing firsthand the stark privileges that separated them from men like himself. Each gilded banquet and each whispered rumor of opulence fueled a slow-burning resentment. By late 1756, Damiens' life had become a vortex of personal loss and mounting disillusion. His wife's health, frail since the birth of their 3rd child, deteriorated rapidly under the strain of repeated childbirth and poverty. Their small Parisian garret, once brightened by the laughter of their children, now rattled with coughs and feverish delirium. Day after day, Damiens watched his beloved succumb to illness, her body wasting away without commiseration from distant superiors. The meager wages he drew from the crown fell short of basic necessities. Bills piled high, and creditors loomed over him like vultures. If misfortune alone were his only burden, he might have borne it in silent misery. But the political climate of France in 1756 heaped fresh stones upon his soul. King Louis V, though outwardly magnificent and favored by a certain faction of nobles, had lost much of his popular prestige by the mid-century. His extravagant lifestyle, symbolized by ornate palaces, endless fêtes, and the famous Madame de Pompadour, sat uneasily against the country's rising financial crisis. The crown's coffers bled as France prepared for conflict with Britain in the 7 Years' War, and rumors circulated that heavy taxes would soon press down on even the humblest citizen. Peasants in the provinces murmured about betrayal. The king spent France into bankruptcy, yet expected suffering from those who could least afford it. In the bustling salons of Paris, pamphlets circulated decrying the monarchy's profligacy, while anger simmered in the taverns and markets. Damiens, once deferential, now drank in these resentments. Every whispered lament about taxes and crushing debt deepened his conviction that Louis XV had lost his divine right to rule. Yet the spark that ignited Damiens' irreversible decision came not from national politics alone, but from his own twisting agony. He was arrested in early January 1757, after the authorities discovered that he had carefully shopped for a stiletto knife and had been observed lurking near the Palais Royal late at night. Under searing interrogation, Damiens divulged a fragmented confession. He believed himself divinely appointed to punish the king for unjust governance. As early as October, he had begun to write letters alternately addressed to village magistrates and to the king himself, calling for the sovereign's removal by whatever means necessary. In Damiens' fevered mind, his wife's impending death and his family's destitution were direct results of royal indifference. Disease and hunger he thought were instruments of regal cruelty, proof that the Sun King had abandoned his subjects to suffering. Psychologically, Damiens exhibited all the signs of a man ravaged by grief and obsession. During his trial in late January court, physicians documented his trembling hands and intermittent convulsions. Witnesses testified that he muttered prayers to both God and Enlightenment philosophers as he awaited judgment, his mind teetering between religious zealotry and secular outrage. At times he wept in rage, tears born not of regret for his deed, but of vindictive certainty that only bloodshed could rectify the moral imbalance. Court records mention how Damiens displayed a curious calm when recounting his plan to kill the king. "I have only one life to offer," he stated, "and it shall serve justice." His gaze remained steady, even when the judge read his death sentence, an ominous sign that he had relinquished hope of mercy long before stepping up to the scaffold. Politically, his crime sent shockwaves through the highest circles of power. Louis XIV's ministers feared that the assassination attempt would embolden other malcontents, spurring a wave of regicides to overturn the monarchy. The Parlement of Paris, then both a judicial and semi-legislative body, convened for emergency sessions. They debated whether to consign Damiens to a standard form of capital punishment or revert to the ancient savage penalty reserved for traitors who shed royal blood, the chevalet, in which his limbs would be tied, and 4 horses would tear him apart. Some judges argued for a symbolic restraint, fearing that excessive brutality might inflame public sentiment yet further. Others countered that only an exemplary display of ironclad authority could deter future conspiracies and restore divine respect for the throne. In the end, King Louis XV himself decreed that Damiens would suffer the ultimate punishment, a choice reflective of both personal affront and political calculation. The monarch's edict emphasized that his assailant must endure a fate even the most hardened criminals seldom faced, lest any subject doubt the inviolability of royal person. Medical observers meanwhile turned a clinical eye to the physical toll on Damiens as his execution loomed. Guards reported that he grew gaunt, his emaciated frame unnervingly still. The harsh January chill seemed to sink into his very bones. His lips turned blue at times, whether from frost or terrified anticipation, no one could say. By the second week of imprisonment, Damiens suffered relentless nightmares. Accounts from fellow prisoners spoke of him tossing beneath threadbare blankets, his face contorted in terror, as if reliving some primal horror. A scraggly beard sprouted on his cheeks, unkempt and matted, as if his mind no longer considered daily rituals of cleanliness important. A warder recalled catching him, whispering a litany of grievances first against the king, then against God, then against himself, forever believing that violence could right such wrongs. On rare occasions he refused to eat, declaring that starvation is but a prelude to what must come. These abject conditions only bolstered the macabre fascination of the Parisian public. In tattered pamphlets passed hand-to-hand rumors proliferated. Some claimed that Damiens's death would be a bloodbath so immense that the square would run red for hours. Others asserted that certain nobles had bribed the executioners to proceed with extra viciousness, ensuring that body parts would hang for days as a stark warning. Physicians and barbers, some ethically compelled, some opportunistic, prepared to study the body afterward, hoping to glean insights into the physiology of terror and death. For them, human flesh torn by horses offered a grim laboratory for anatomy. In neighboring villages, preachers used Damiens' fate as a parable sin. They preached cannot flourish. Divine justice will always prevail, even if enacted by mortal hands. Yet beneath the roar of political outrage and the cold calculators of physicians, there existed a quieter, more profound terror in Damiens' psyche. During fleeting moments of lucidity, he seemed to realize the futility of his vengeance. One jailer described finding him trembling before a simple wooden crucifix, tears streaking his dirt-smeared face. He knelt for what felt like hours, as though trying to persuade some silent deity to alter the course of fate. Then, abruptly, he would rise and pace his cell with obsessive intent, mapping each step he would take on the scaffold. It was as though 2 people lived within him, one consumed by righteous fury, the other by consuming remorse. This internal schism produced a sense of spectacle rather than mere criminality, making him both a cautionary tale and a figure of dark sympathy. By the eve of his execution, January 28th, Damiens could scarce stand upright. A ghastly pallor draped over him. His skin appeared almost translucent under dim candlelight, like parchment left too long by an open flame. The physician who conducted the final exam noted that his pulse was weak and erratic, his breathing ragged. Should a lesser man have faced such torment, they surmised he would have already succumbed to pneumonia or outright collapse. Yet Damiens persisted, perhaps fueled by a perverse form of defiance. His hands, chafed by tight ropes, shook so violently that he had to grip the bars of his cell to steady himself. Through the iron bars, he caught a glimpse of the scaffold rising outside a wooden contrivance, as sinister as any battlefield siege engine of old. That night, in a feverish dreamscape, he believed he saw himself torn asunder in slow motion, each sinew and bone exposed to the merciless eyes of Paris. In the courtyard, adjacent to the Palais de Justice, preparations continued into the small hours. Executioners haggled over the strength of ropes necessary to bind Damiens' arms and legs to 4 impatient horses. The animals themselves were housed in makeshift pens nearby their massive flanks, shifting in restless agitation at the rustle of straw. Officials peered at the sky, noting the tenuous hope of a crisp dawn. Any rain or thaw could turn the square into a mire, rendering the spectacle less efficient, less fearsome. Even a hint of mercy would mar the king's message that schism between subject and sovereign could never close. And so they waited, ensuring that not a single soul doubted the resolve of a monarchy, whose power, though beset by war and scandal, remained absolute, unyielding. By sunrise, the boundaries between political science and raw human suffering had blurred completely. France teetered on the cusp of an era defined by reason and progress, yet here on the edge of the Place de Grève, the past's cruelest rituals asserted themselves with renewed vigor. In the heart of revolution, though none yet foretold, Damiens embodied the final relic of medieval justice, a man who dared to challenge an immutable throne, and was consigned to a death that no theory of natural rights could undo. As the first pale rays of light touched the scaffold, the silent lament of this shattered soul echoed through the city. Grief, ambition, desperation, and historical inevitability had converged in a single tragic figure. When the first pale rays of dawn brushed the scaffold at the Place de Grève, a hush fell over the gathered masses, broken only by the creak of wooden beams and the restless snort of the horses. The condemned Robert-François Damiens, now frail and almost spectral in appearance, was escorted from the dark confines of his cell. A priest murmured final absolution, his voice trembling beneath the weight of the moment. Damiens' face was ashen, his eyes reflecting a tumult of dread and something akin to resignation. Each step toward the platform was both a surrender to inevitability and a final act of defiance against a world he believed had wronged him. The executioners, their faces hidden beneath black hoods, moved with solemn precision, securing Damiens' arms to iron rings affixed at the 4 corners of a low wooden frame. His legs were bound, similarly splayed outward, in an arrangement that replicated a grotesque cruciform. The ropes were coarse and bit into raw flesh, eliciting faint whimpers that dissolved quickly into stone-cold silence. Nearby, the 4 horses stamped their hooves in tension. Their breath hung in frozen puffs that vanished into the gray air. Each animal was chosen for its raw strength, its flank ablaze with muscle beneath a glossy coat. They had been led onto the platform in the early darkness, their harnesses adjusted so that when the signal was given, they could pull outward with maximum force. A royal magistrate perched on a raised dais read aloud the decree for the attempted regicide of King Louis XV. Damiens would suffer the most severe punishment known to law. The crowd murmured, some recoiling in horror, others leaning forward in fascination. The magistrate's voice, though measured, carried the gravity of irrevocable judgment. The stiletto wound to the sovereign's shoulder demanded that Damiens be torn, limb from limb, his body, a testament to the inviolable sanctity of royal blood. When the final words were uttered, a foreboding stillness gripped all present. Even the wind seemed to take a breath before disaster. Then, at a subtle gesture from an attendant, the executioners moved behind the beasts and drew back the reins. In an instant, the horses lunged outward in 4 divergent directions. Damiens let out a strangled cry that sounded both human and otherworldly, a desperate protest against the unimaginable force tearing at his body. The ropes tightened, cutting into flesh like the cruel edge of a guillotine, and his limbs jerked in violent arcs as sinew and tendon resisted the inexorable pull. The horses strained their hooves, digging into the wooden platform as they implanted every ounce of power into the task. Blood erupted a dark fountain, staining the pale wood beneath him. Bones cracked audibly first at the shoulders, then at the hips, as Damiens's body began to unravel. His chest split in a final shuddering convulsion, the ribcage giving way to the relentless pressure. Flesh tore apart in ragged shreds, exposing raw muscle and marrow to the cold morning air. A terrible howl escaped his lips, a sound that resonated beyond mere agony, an echo of existential betrayal, as though his very soul was wrenched from the mortal realm. Around the square, reactions ranged from silent horror to morbid fascination. Some covered their eyes, unable to bear the sight. Others leaned in, compelled by the spectacle. Shouts of revulsion and awe mingled with the snapping of muskets fired by royal guards, as a warning to any who might consider similar treasonous deeds. The horses, despite reins slackening near the end, continued to paw and snort, unwilling to relinquish their hold until their handlers forcibly restrained them. Splinters of bloodied rope and ragged strips of clothing fluttered in the winter wind, like macabre streamers marking the boundary between life and obliteration. Despite the brutality, a perverse order guided the executioner's work. As each limb detached, they applied torches to sear exposed arteries and cauterize wounds, preventing the body's final shudders from interrupting the spectacle. In the most chilling aspect of the ritual, after the primary dismemberment, they halted the horses and approached Damien's torso with long iron hooks. With mechanical calm, they pried open the split fragments to extract the heart, still fluttering in pale terror. In a gesture both symbolic and abhorrent, an executioner thrust the quivering organ skyward, declaring that the traitor's heart would never betray the crown again. Screams of anguish mingled with gasps of revulsion as that final emblem of defiance was displayed. Some onlookers turned away, stomachs heaving from nausea. Children hidden behind parents' skirts whimpered quietly. A handful of die-hard loyalists gave thanks aloud, invoking God's justice and declaring the monarchy's power inviolate. Others stood in dumbstruck silence, minds racing with questions about human cruelty, the precariousness of life, and the weight of despotic authority. As the horses were led away, their tails drenched in pool of blood, a sudden coldness descended on the square. Where Damiens had once knelt, only fragments of his person remained an arm. Here a leg there, splayed in a grotesque tableau. The executioners gathered the severed limbs and placed them in iron cages set upon poles at the platform's perimeter, an enduring warning to any subjects who might betray royal blood. The heart, once a pulsating oasis of life, lay bloody and still upon a silver tray, destined to be buried beneath the foundations of a new chapel, as an offering of penance and a grim deterrent. This apex of cruelty served a dual purpose: to satiate the public's thirst for vengeance and to solidify the monarchy's grip on power. High-ranking officials, clad in powdered wigs and somber attire, stood just beyond the blood-slick platform, discussing the political ramifications. They spoke in hushed tones of the necessity to demonstrate absolute authority in an era when Enlightenment ideas of liberty and reason were spreading like wildfire through Parisian salons. More than ever, They feared that any sign of leniency would embolden dissenters. Meanwhile, in the hushed galleries of the medical fraternity, physicians exchanged animated whispers about the anatomical significance of what had occurred. Surgeons, galvanized by grim curiosity, pondered whether Damiens's body would yield insights into human physiology under extreme trauma. They debated conducting dissections on the remnants, rationalizing that from such horror might arise a deeper comprehension of the body's resilience and limits. For them, scientific inquiry existed in uneasy proximity to moral revulsion. They recognized that their fascination was born of mortality's darkest edge. Back on the scaffold, a grim serenity settled as executioners methodically prepared to conclude the ritual. They severed the head, last leaving it as a final token atop a pike driven into the frozen earth. This ultimate act, the decapitation, carried its own significance. The sovereign now possessed the traitor's head, a stark lesson that any who conspired against the crown would suffer not just as criminals, but as pariahs stripped of their very identities. Damien's lifeless eyes stared skyward, unseeing, yet reflecting a world forever changed by his final desperate act. In those vacant orbs lay a tragic irony. A man who believed that by shedding blood he would ignite a revolution, instead became the last soul to experience a punishment so archaic that its brutality transcended rational explanation. His body, tattered and fragmented, would linger in the collective memory of France as a symbol of both tyrannical authority and the destructive power of fanatic vengeance. As the sun rose higher, scattering pale light across the blood-splattered platform, church bells tolled across Paris, a discordant hymn for a soul torn apart and a kingdom reaffirming its dominance. The square gradually emptied, leaving only a handful of soldiers tasked with removing the iron cages and burning what remained. Though the spectacle's physical remnants would vanish, its psychological scars would endure. Over time, artists sketched the horrific scene in clandestine engravings. Pamphleteers wrote diatribes decrying the cruelty, and poets composed elegies lamenting the loss of compassion in an age of ostentatious terror. In whispers among philosophers and commoners alike, Damien's fate was invoked as both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for deeper reflection on the nature of justice and the fragility of human dignity. In the days that followed, debates raged within the Parlement and the king's inner circle. Some ministers, privately unsettled by the public display, argued that such excess might undermine the monarchy's moral standing. Others countered that fear was the monarchy's most effective defense. As officials contemplated reforms, the November winds of dissent that would later become the winds of revolution had not yet taken shape. Still, the seeds of discontent sprouted in tragic soil, nourished by the vivid memory of a man ripped apart for daring to dream of justice. Thus, at the climax of his ordeal, Damiens had been stripped of flesh and identity, leaving only a lesson etched in red upon the conscience of the nation. Absolute power wielded without restraint can destroy not only bodies, but the very foundations of collective humanity. In tearing him limb from limb, France both reaffirmed the sanctity of royal blood and exposed the darkest impulses that lurked beneath its gilded surface. The crisis reached its zenith not merely in the physical dismemberment, but in the shattering of illusions, the belief that a kingdom could maintain righteous authority through terror, that a people would submit without question to cruelty, branded as justice. In the hushed aftermath of the grisly spectacle, a weighty solemnity settled over the Place de Grève. The horses, their flanks still dripping crimson, were hurriedly led away by executioners, whose faces remained obscured behind somber hoods. A handful of soldiers approached the scattered iron cages, retrieving the severed limbs, each wrapped in coarse linen and bound for display atop poles lining a remote stretch of the city's outskirts. The torches, once ablaze to illuminate the dismemberment, flickered low, as though reluctant to confront the finality of what had transpired. By mid-morning, The physical traces of Damiens' body were stripped away. No fragment remained upon the scaffold except an overturned wooden block, blackened by blood, and etched with splintered grooves where the executioners had worked with grim precision. Yet the true weight of Damiens' death did not reside solely in the fragments of flesh and bone. It echoed most profoundly in the collective conscience of a nation abruptly reminded of its own precariousness. News of the execution rippled through Paris and beyond, carried by couriers and commoners alike. In taverns, impassioned debates erupted as such brutality necessary to preserve order, or had the monarchy surrendered its moral high ground to vengeance? In dimly lit drawing rooms, aristocrats exchanged uneasy glances, some defending the decree as a vital deterrent, others cringing at the memory of a man's heart torn from his chest and displayed as a warning. Even among clergy, those entrusted with ministering to souls nearing death, a question quietly emerged: could mercy endure in a realm so quick to sacrifice compassion for the sake of spectacle? Within the royal court, the response was muted, yet laden with tension. King Louis XV, ensconced in the opulence of the Palace of Versailles, received word in a ceremony marked by understated formality. Advisers lauded the execution as a reaffirmation of divine right, praising the monarch for displaying unwavering resolve. Yet behind closed doors, ministers voiced caution. They feared that portraits of regal power, built on such elemental terror, might loosen the regime's fragile foundation rather than fortify it. Whispers of reform, long stifled by the weight of precedent, stirred among enlightened courtiers who held sympathy for those suffering under oppressive taxation. Louis XV, in his private chambers, reportedly paused over a letter from a provincial governor describing pleas for clemency for Damiens' impoverished family. The king, for all his authority, appeared haunted by uncertainty had he defended the crown or surrendered French justice to its darkest impulses. In the weeks following January 28th, the fractured remains of Damiens' body became instruments of message rather than morality. His arms and legs, each encased in rusting iron cages, were fastened atop posts along the banks of the Seine, where riverboats paused to pass the morbid testament. The heart preserved in wine and sealed within a leaden casket was interred beneath a stone altar in a newly erected chapel dedicated to the sanctity of royal blood. Pilgrims wove through narrow streets to pay tribute, pressing coins into the offering plate and murmuring prayers for both justice and the lost life of the condemned. Yet this ritual carried undercurrents of unease. In hushed tones, some confided their horror that a divinely ordained vessel should yield to such barbaric ritual. Artists eager to seize upon the potent combination of sanctity and savagery sketched clandestine etchings of the grisly scenes, disseminating them as political propaganda or moral cautionary fables. Meanwhile, the family of Robert-François Damiens, bereft of husband and father, faced its own agonizing reckoning. News of the execution pummeled them like the final blow. His wife, already weakened by illness, succumbed to shock and grief mere days later, her spirit extinguished as though life itself had lost meaning. Their children, 3 small souls now orphaned, were taken in by distant kin, carrying with them the enduring stigma of patricide and betrayal. Occasional petitions reached the Parlement beseeching clemency, or even a modest pension to support the surviving kin. All were denied. The state refused to relent, deeming such charity a dishonor to the memory of royal blood spilled. Thus they too became collateral casualties in a punishment meant to warn an entire nation, their suffering a silent echo of Damiens' final desperate act. Across broader France, fissures began to appear in subjects' relationship to the crown. Curé François Duval of Saint-Rémy, a parish priest in the Champagne region, recorded in his journal that villagers refused to discuss the execution without lowering their voices to a conspiratorial hush. They wondered if the king truly understood the depths of resentment, borne by those forced to watch their neighbors starve under crushing taxes. Duval's entries revealed a hitherto latent compassion, as agrarian families donated grains to hidden soup kitchens, small acts of solidarity against what they perceived to be the coldness of an indifferent regime. In urban centers such as Lyon and Nantes, pamphlets circulated demanding restraint. Justice must not murder. Mercy read one anonymously printed broadside. Young men imbued with Enlightenment philosophy stenciled manifestos on walls decrying an authoritarian state that exalted cruelty as proof of power. At the same time, the medical community, mortified by the anatomical carnage they had witnessed, convened an emergency council at the Faculty of Medicine in Paris. Physicians debated whether to campaign for more regulated capital punishment, arguing that even as the state demanded retribution, it must not violate natural law by gruesome excess. A petition emerged, signed by prominent surgeons, proposing that capital sentences be carried out with minimal suffering, a radical notion in an age where public terror remained the monarchy's most potent weapon. Though the petition failed to sway royal decree, it marked an ideological earthquake, a growing recognition that barbarity served neither justice nor societal progress. Religious authorities, too, grappled with the spiritual consequences. The Archbishop of Paris delivered a sermon condemning the severity of the punishment as contrary to Christian charity, urging parishioners to remember that God's justice tempered divine wrath with mercy. His sermon was not universally applauded. In some quarters it was denounced as undermining royal authority. Yet more peasants and townsfolk began attending Mass with particular fervor, seeking solace in an institution still perceived as a refuge from secular power's tyranny. By spring's thaw, the physical reminders of Damiens' dismemberment were all but erased, limbs removed from their macabre perches, the chapel's altar sealed and obscure. Yet in the intimate spaces of memory among families, soldiers, courtiers, and commoners, the echoes of that January execution endured. The event had seared upon the national psyche a stark lesson. The glorification of violence as spectacle could fracture trust in institutions meant to protect, not terrorize. In private salons, educated elites whispered about alternative forms of punishment that would not tear at the very fabric of humanity. Political salons, once devoted to etiquette and fashion, became incubators for revolutionary thought. If justice required restraint, could a people truly be free under a monarch who endorsed grotesque cruelty? Thus Damiens' death marked not simply the end of a single life, but a turning point in French consciousness. His execution intended to cement the inviolability of royal blood, instead exposed the monarchy's vulnerability to moral critique. In tearing him limb from limb, France had affirmed its power, but at the cost of planting seeds of dissent in hallowed soil. As the execution's memory coalesced into legend, it fueled a broader reckoning that true authority demands not only fear, but also the tempered compassion that separates justice from atrocity. In the months and years that followed the dreadful spectacle at the Place de Grève, the repercussions of Damiens' brutal demise rippled far beyond the blood-stained timbers of the scaffold. Parisian society found itself confronting a stark duality: the monarchy's ostensible display of unassailable authority contrasted with an undercurrent of moral shock that undermined the veneer of regal legitimacy. For many citizens, the event crystallized an unsettling realization that power wielded without restraint could corrode the social contract and erode the very foundations of justice. Families in the provinces, reeling from heavy taxation and subsistence-level existence, whispered of solidarity. They no longer viewed royal edicts as benevolent directives, but as instruments of distant cruelty. In intellectual circles, the execution galvanized heated debates about the nature of punishment itself. Enlightenment philosophers seized upon Damiens' fate as evidence that fear, when used as the principal means of control, inevitably sowed seeds of resentment and instability. even as the iron cages that once displayed his limbs were removed and the chapel's altar sealed, the moral scars lingered. People began to question whether law's purpose was to protect human dignity or to amplify the state's power through spectacle. Politically, Damiens's dismemberment marked an inflection point in France's gradual shift from absolutism toward modern notions of rights and proportional justice. Though King Louis XV's ministers had justified the atrocity as a bulwark against regicidal impulses, the episode inadvertently cast light on the unsustainability of governing through terror alone. Several members of the Parliament of Paris, once staunch defenders of royal prerogative, quietly acknowledged that such cruelty could delegitimize the crown, rather than fortify it. Private petitions and salon conversations fueled proposals for judicial reforms, calls for more humane sentencing, clearer legal standards, and limitations on capital punishment. Physicians and legal scholars collaborated to produce treatises decrying torture's inhumanity, arguing that a civilized society should seek truth and rehabilitation rather than public mutilation. Though these voices remained a minority within the corridors of power, their ideas found fertile ground among the literate middle classes and some sympathetic nobles. In tracing French law's lineage, later reformers would point to Damiens's execution as a glaring example of medieval cruelty, persisting long after reason and compassion should have prevailed. Culturally, the memory of that January morning achieved near-mythic status. Underground pamphlets carrying clandestine sketches of the dismembered figure circulated among urban workers and tradesmen, blending factual detail with moral exhortations. Poets and playwrights constrained by censorship sometimes cloaked their references in allegory. A common motif appeared, wherein a once proud oak tree was hewn by 4 hidden axes, illustrating how unchecked authority could devastate even the mightiest. In private families shared hushed accounts of the execution as cautionary parables for children. Let no man think he can oppose authority without paying a dire price. Simultaneously, the Church wrestled with reconciling its teachings of mercy and forgiveness with the state-sanctioned cruelty that had been publicly ordained. Some clergy withdrew from overt political involvement, concerned that collaboration with such punishments might tarnish their spiritual mission. Yet perhaps the most lasting legacy of Damiens' fate lay in the slow transformation of public sensibility. A generation later, when the storm of revolution gathered force, the collective memory of medieval barbarity served as a rallying cry for change. The idea that a monarch could sanction such extreme violence seemed incompatible with emerging ideals of human dignity and equality. For those who would later stake their lives on the guillotine's blade, seeking to sever the very institution that had perfected spectacle over justice, the image of a man torn by 4 horses remained indelibly seared into their consciousness. They viewed his death not as the triumph of order, but as the ultimate failure of a regime that demanded obedience through terror rather than consent. Although the monarchy survived for decades beyond that dark January, it did so under the shadow of its own hypocrisy. Damiens' execution became a moral touchstone in discussions about the legitimacy of capital punishment. Over time, legal reforms, however incremental, began to emphasize proportionality and humane treatment of the condemned. By the late 18th century, pamphleteers extolled the virtues of sound legal procedure and condemned revenge masquerading as justice. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, many revolutionaries invoked Damiens' fate as one in a litany of grievances against despotism. In the tumult that followed, France embraced a new ethos that no ruler, however divine, should command the right to shatter bone and sinew to preserve authority. In contemplating this grim legacy, we discern a profound message that true justice cannot rest upon cycles of cruelty. The dismemberment of a man, however guilty, reveals the fragility of a society that equates power with fear. When the state subordinates compassion to spectacle, it risks cultivating the very dissidents it aims to suppress. Above all, Damiens' end urges modern audiences to reflect on the precarious balance between authority and humanity. It reminds us that laws serve not to showcase might, but to safeguard collective dignity. That governance rooted in terror ultimately sows seeds of its own downfall, and that in the tapestry of history, cruelty corrodes more than flesh, it corrodes legitimacy. As you consider the gruesome tableau of a man torn apart by horses, ask yourself, what price does a society pay when it sacrifices mercy for vengeance? How might we guard against repeating such dark chapters in our own age? The tale of Robert-François Damiens should encourage vigilance that we might champion a justice tempered by empathy rather than horror, lest we discover too late that the cruelty we unleash upon others returns to rend our social fabric asunder.